Well, okay, welcome to the HRM chapter presentation on the disability tax credit. And I'd like to introduce our guest speaker tonight. Will be Faye Woodman, professor at Dell Law. And so I'm going to, before we begin, I do want to thank Todd McMillan, our techie, who I always forget to thank at the end of the night. He's been doing this faithfully. We've been live casting now for a year and a half.
Wow.
So, anyway, we'll have a good night learning about the tax credit.
Okay.
Thank you, Faye.
And I want to thank Todd too, because I could not figure out how to upload the disability tax credit certificate. So you have some magic that I don't have.
We do lots of things. We disperse to people for information and forms, so we have it down to a science now.
That's excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to be here today. I commend the people who managed to actually be here in person or online. I assume that maybe in the future some other people may take advantage of this presentation. I know it's a very busy night indeed for Canadians, and this is not the venue to take sides, but I can say, go Jays.
You can say that.
Tonight I'm going to talk about, and I'm referring to my first slide for those of you who are not here in person, and I'm going to talk, as was advertised, about the disability tax credit. And what I'm going to do is talk about what it is, who can claim it, which is difficult sometimes, why it's important. It's important because it reduces the taxes of persons with disabilities or their relatives. And that's an importance in itself, but it has importance because it gives one access to other strategies to support the financial status of the person with disability and their families. There is also alternatives. If for whatever reason the person with disability or the family doesn't qualify through that person for the disability tax credit. There are alternatives, and I'm going to suggest a few. This is primarily a presentation about the disability tax credits, but I'm going to allude to some other things, like, for example, we were talking about it, the Henson Trust and the new Qualified Disability Trust. And finally, what I'm going to do is, because there's a certain element of inertia, at least for me, and I suspect for some others here and elsewhere, there's a certain amount of inertia in filling out forms and making claims and doing things that are generally good for us. And so I've actually brought some forms for you to look at tonight. And if you have a form, that's probably the first step in considering not only whether the person with disabilities can qualify for the disability tax credit, but whether you might actually look at some other strategies to fund family members with disabilities. And I should say before I go on, my primary concern this evening will be persons with disabilities, and that disability is mental illness. That's what I'm primarily concerned about. There are people watching this who would say, oh, you didn't talk about this and that, and I didn't deliberately because I'm focusing on a person with disability who also does not have a physical disability. In that circumstance, if there's both a mental disability and a physical disability, then there are different criteria, different considerations. I'm just thinking of a person with disabilities, which is a mental illness. So if we look at the disability tax credit first, we see that it is actually worth quite a lot of money to us. It can reduce our taxes by $1,830 a year. That's quite a chunk of change. Now, one of the things you should be concerned about or careful with is a lot of politicians talk about the disability deduction or credit of $7,899. Well, that's a basis on which it's calculated, and that's a basis on which the federal credit is calculated, and the provincial credit is calculated on a slightly different basis. But the total value, federal and provincial, for the disability tax credit is $1,830. Don't get too excited when you see that number, $78.99. The disability tax credit, as the name suggests, is in fact a credit against taxes. It's not a deduction against income, but it reduces your taxes. Now, once you use the disability tax credit and your other credits to reduce your taxes to zero, then that's the end of the good of the disability tax credit to you. It's no further use to it. It's not refundable. If you say $700 of the disability tax credit and you've got, about another $1,000 left or a little more than that, you can't go to the government and say, well, I used part of it. Now I've got $700 left. Can I have a check for that? It's non-refundable. Once you reduce your tax to zero, that's the end of it. But the person with disability is able to transfer the disability tax credit to one of two people, his or her spouse, or secondly, to someone who's called a supporting individual. And we'll talk about that in detail later, because as we know, and it's shocking that in Canada today, many people with disabilities, and this is all disabilities, are very low income. So they're not going to be able to use most or any of the disability tax credit. And I should mention, just as an aside, that the disability supplement for persons with disabilities under 18, and that is a significant amount of money, $974. Now this is the rub, this is the difficulty. How do you determine if you or a person in your family qualifies for the disability tax credit? And there's certain tests that we have to apply. The disability must be severe and prolonged. And with respect to the prolonged bit, it has to have lasted, or is going to last at least 12 months. So this prolonged criteria is quite difficult. And when you see that, for example, I could be quite disabled, I could break both my legs, but it wouldn't fall within the definition of prolonged, because it's unlikely that even if I broke my legs, well, maybe it would, it's going to last for, more, 12 months or more. So you've got the 12-month period. And then to add to that, the disability must be severe. It must markedly restrict the activities of daily living. And that is, it must do this to the person with disability at least 90% of the time. And for people with mental disabilities, this is problematic, as you know, because ourselves or our loved ones may have periods when we're really quite good and periods when we're not very good. And what does this 90% of the time mean if we cycle in and out of periods of wellness and not so much wellness? I'll refer to that again. Well, what are the activities of daily living or activities of everyday life? Basically, if you talk about physical disability, it's pretty simple, and it is pretty severe. The disability tax credit isn't for everybody. It isn't for every disability. It's only for severe disabilities. And in the physical realm, it's things like you can't walk, or walk very little. You're blind, you can't hear, you can't speak, you can't feed yourself, you can't dress yourself. You can't take care of your elimination, that sort of thing, and usually a very severe aspect of that. So that you can see this disability tax credit is for severe disabilities. Applied to a person with disabilities with mental illness, it is that the person with the mental illness cannot function in everyday life. That they have problems with memory, with problem solving, with goal setting and judgment, maybe taken together and adapt to functioning. Now this, to me, course, I'm not a doctor. Sounds like a lot of gobbledygook. And frankly, I don't know what it means. I do work in the area of elder law too, and it's different kinds of disabilities for the elderly. And some of the cases and the material given out by the CRA are more oriented towards seniors. But what does it mean if you have a person with disability who's a young person or someone even older but not a senior? What does it mean when they have problems with their memory, goal setting and judgment? To some extent, we're all like that. I had problems with goal setting today. I had problems with the goal setting of getting up today, and judgment and whatever. So, when can we qualify for the disability tax credit? And I'll try to illuminate that a little more later on. And the person who can verify that or certify for the disability tax credit, that can be, with respect to mental illness, either a doctor or a psychologist. A doctor doesn't have to be a psychiatrist, but often is. Now, mental illness is particularly problematic. Before we look at a disability that is mental illness, we should look at some general rules applying to the disability tax credit. And the first thing we have to understand, it isn't the impairment, it isn't the name that gives you the right to the disability tax credit. It is the disease's effects on what you can do. So you can have a very serious diagnosis, but if you're functioning pretty well, you won't qualify for the disability tax credit. And so too, you can have, I don't know, in the area of mental illness, but there are more benign diagnoses. We probably would recognize some of them, but if the effect of those diagnoses are less function, then that person may in fact be able to claim a disability tax credit. And one of the ways that people describe it is that in the area of mental illness, that the person, in order to claim the disability tax credit, cannot function independently and cannot function with reasonable competence in everyday life. But if you're with me too, that's still a little vague. Well, you should know that each case depends on its facts, and to a considerable degree, it's whether that impairment is less or greater severity. And the intent, essentially, as laid down by the courts at least, is that not everybody who suffers a disability should be able to claim the disability tax credit. But the hurdle to claiming it shouldn't be so great that nobody can claim it. And sometimes I think with talking with various families and people dealing with loved ones who's ill, they sometimes think that the hurdles are too high and that the evidentiary burden is too high. We'll talk about that in a minute. The courts have said that where there is some ambiguity, some discrepancy, some inability to determine whether the disability tax credit applies or not, that the balance should go to the person claiming the disability tax credit. The disability tax credit, as I said, is problematic to apply, particularly when someone has a mental illness. And it is problematic for a number of reasons. One of the major reasons is that problem of 10% of the time. You have, only 10% of the time can you be sort of competent to do the activities of daily living. But we know that many people with mental illness are really quite competent in the activities of daily living, of perceiving, thinking, and remembering, really far more than 10% of the time, maybe most of the time. But the CRA and the courts have taken the position that if a person with therapy and medication really functions pretty well most of the time, but is subject to, for example, psychotic breaks or different kinds of breakdowns, and that they will happen maybe several times a year. As a result, that we can think of them as needing daily supervision just because of the looming threat of the concern over the particular psychotic break or breakdown or whatever. I'm not sure that Revenue Canada's position really reflects or is very sensitive to the lived reality of families. I just advance it and describe it because this is the kind of suit that you're going to have to fit yourself in. Another way of looking at that, and I think my ER has taken a runner, is can a person protect themselves from danger? Have they have some attachment to time and the flow of time? And finally, are they able in some basic way to take care of money in their financial affairs? That's another way of looking at it. But again, I come back to the lived reality of many families where they have loved ones that they really can't be apart from too much, not because of the current position, but because of the concern of what might happen, of some sort of breakdown or some sort of, at least hopefully short break in this period of really quite good wellness. So that's a problem, and that's a problem if you have a person with mental illness, that's a problem of fitting into this suit that Revenue Canada says you have to wear.
May I interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
Does a physician who understands the family picture, does his or her voice not sort of confirm to the lawmakers that this is in fact a family that deserves the credit?
Well, part of the problem, doctors' opinions are really very significant. When we go look through this form, we're going to see that in order to get the disability tax credit, the doctor has to fill out a part of this form and certify that this is a person with prolonged severe disability and that it impacts on the activities of daily living. So you have to get the doctor on side. But the doctor is obviously going to try to comply with Revenue Canada's laid down criteria and the legislation and that, and some doctors might not consider that a particular person is, even though they may be ill, even though they may be disabled, they wouldn't fit the criteria of 90% of the time not being able to, 90% of the time being disabled. May I pass these out? I don't think we have enough. There's some more here. So it's not so simple as a doctor filling out the certificate. One, because the doctor may say and look at a patient, and the doctor may say, well, 90% of the time you're not ill. And that's a very unsubtle way of looking at it, but that's what some doctors will say. And if you can't get the doctor or psychologist on side, you have a real problem. Because Revenue Canada will not give you this disability tax credit. They'll make their own assessment ultimately, but the first step is to have the doctor on side or the psychologist on side.
If you do have it on side.
If you do have them on side, it's a great benefit. It's also a great benefit of that psychologist or doctor has had some experience in filling out these forms and some experience. Revenue Canada might come back to the doctor, psychologist does from time to time and ask further questions. So you have to have a doctor or psychologist on site. Sometimes they're busy. They don't think it is this is their role to fill out forms for the government, and they're very uncooperative, and I've heard about that. Sometimes they think, lawyers sometimes think they're doctors. I mean, I go on the web and look at MD or whatever it's called all the time. So sometimes doctors think that they're lawyers. And they have an idea of what the disability tax credit is for and what it is, and you can't move them. And you've got a real problem, particularly if you have a person with a mental disability, because they may have developed a long-term therapeutic relationship. And if they're at loggerheads with this particular therapist about filling up this form, they might have to choose, and it's a terrible choice, between the therapeutic relationship and getting this form filled out, because if they go for a second opinion to another doctor, one, the other doctor may not want to interfere, but secondly, it's going to disrupt the first relationship. So you don't seem to have that particular difficulty with physical disabilities so much as with mental disabilities.
It's my understanding that one of the huge drawbacks of the doctors really not wanting to fill out forms is the time. It's not billable hours for the doctor.
Mm. And I'm not sure whether I suspect they can. This is something they can charge you for to fill out. I mean, but yeah. They can charge for all sorts of other forms, so I suspect.
That would be fine if they did that.
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't do that.
I know.
I had to take mine to an appeal to CRA. Went back
Really?
and forth between the doc, but eventually it got it. Now, it'll be interesting to see when it's up for review, which is next year, what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a real problem because Revenue Canada basically doesn't want to take any application for the disability tax credit unless they have the doctor on site. I've known some cases where they've had a negative opinion from the doctor and they've taken it to court anyway. They've appealed it to the tax court. Mm-hmm. The problem with that, it's a technical legal problem, is that generally the result will be that the tax court will throw it back to Revenue Canada. So there was never any point to go there in the first place. Or only occasionally, if they really see bias or wrong interpretation of the law by the doctor, only occasionally where they really interfere and substitute their own judgment. So it's hard to emphasize how important it is.
And I think it's duration, like you said, time. They've got to see that it has existed.
Yeah.
Because the DSM says, really it's the 10-year mark seems to be the magic number. And that's just what my personal experience.
I think you're right. It really has to be a fairly long time with persons with mental illness. It shouldn't be.
No.
It shouldn't be necessarily. I mean, once you get into this and you get a diagnosis, it's very serious. The family works together to support this person, and Revenue Canada being uncooperative, it's a very difficult position because this can be, as we all know, a very expensive proposition supporting a loved one with a severe disability and all the extra expenses that incurs. Yeah, I know. It's very difficult, and so the emphasis is to try to get a doctor on side. The problem is if the doctor won't cooperate, it becomes extremely difficult.
But even with the doctor cooperating, I still had to appeal it.
Yeah, well, that's possible.
So my experience would say, like, you get the doctor on side, but don't give up just because somebody's,
Exactly
a clerk
right.
in this cubicle over here rubber stamped it or something.
And as
So
I
the
said,
reference from your doctor wasn't sufficient.
No,
oh no, they don't just take what the doctor
they kept
says.
coming back for more information.
Yeah. And it's just more information. And as I said, you have to know the suit that you have to fit in. And the suit that you have to fit in with a disability.
Defined in there.
Well, it's
with
defined in
examples.
there.
Yeah.
But
with
it's also
examples.
very particularly that you have to, 90% of the time, be in this state of mental illness where you're not functioning. And as we said, that's not often the nature of mental illness, which is cyclical, it changes from day to day. So it's sometimes very difficult for people who are neither medical personnel nor involved with loved ones as family to really understand this concept of a cyclical mental illness that is there, but is not there at any particular time. But that's the suit you have to fit yourself in.
Well, illness and impairment are two different things.
Oh, yes, well,
I mean, impairment can be there all the time, regardless of whether you are ill or not.
yeah. I think I think the point you're making is a functional, are you?
Well, if somebody has a mental illness that causes them to have a decline in cognitive abilities, they may be behaviorally, they may be perfectly fine and not psychotic and not sick, but they have still lost the ability to remember how to do the laundry or turn on the stove or not start a fire on purpose, you know.
But
that's
some, yeah, I take that point, and that's not very, that's assuming it's severe enough, not problematic. I think where the problem arises, where the person actually functions quite well, that if the cognitive ability may be not so good, it's still good enough to carry on the activities of daily living.
Yeah.
And so Revenue Canada's got to come back and say, well, that person can, you know, look after themselves and make reasonably competent judgments, maybe go to school, indeed, maybe in certain cases even hold some sort of job. But nonetheless, they're impaired. And the impairment is less so much what happens every day, and more that every day we have to be concerned about a breakdown. And that's what we're concerned about. And so then the question you have to ask yourself, is that 90% of all the time are you impaired? And the answer is probably not, in a sense, because 90% of the time or 80% of the time or whatever, you're doing quite well. It's the 20% when you have a breakdown that you're not doing very well.
But a lot of times with a mentally ill person, as you probably know, they might be able to function reasonably well for a large percentage of time. Maybe not, maybe 50%, whatever. But if they're under stress, normal stress, that will trigger them and they'll wind up back in the hospital. So then they are. So you're almost forcing the illness to come back. What is wrong with it? I
agree. I agree. And even Revenue Canada's compromise, which you'll see in a minute, I don't think is sufficient, and we'll look at it in just a minute. The doctor's opinions, as I said, are quite crucial. You have to get a doctor's opinion, but still it's ultimately a matter of law. It's up to Revenue Canada, and you have to fit, as I said, into this sometimes uncomfortable suit. One other thing that I want to talk about is how the disability tax credit can be transferred. The person with the disability can't use all the tax credit or can't use all of it, can transfer the remainder to a spouse. That's pretty straightforward. Or to someone called a supporting individual. And that's a little more complicated. There's 3 real steps in transferring the disability tax credit to a supporting individual. First of all, that supporting individual has to provide support. And they have to provide one or more of the basic necessities, food, shelter, clothing, on a regular and consistent basis. And if the person with disabilities on Welfare Revenue Canada has said it will accept top-ups for necessities as providing support. So to claim the disability tax credit, it's not like some other transfers of credits, I think like the tuition tax credit, where you can claim it even if you haven't been paying the tuition. But with a disability tax credit, you have to provide some sort of support, but it's not complete support. And most families will provide probably sufficient support to qualify. A supporting individual has to be a relative. In other situations, sometimes you can transfer credits to people who are not relatives, but the disability tax credit must be transferred to a relative, and it's a fairly large group, a parent obviously, grandparent, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, niece, or nephew. So that's a broad group. However, the tricky part is that once you get away from the parents and it's transfer, say, for a child to a parent, it may be more complex because of this third rule that the supporting individual must have been either eligible to claim a tax credit, some other kind of tax credit, in respect of the person with disabilities, or could have claimed a tax credit, but for the income or the age of the person with disability. Now, that is quite complex, and most of us, when we're claiming with respect to a child, don't have to worry about this third criteria. But it's something that is going to come up when you're filling out your tax form, and you have to realize there's a third criterion. We're going to look at in a minute these other tax credits to see what they might involve. And beware in claiming the disability tax credit that even if you can't work doesn't mean you're eligible for the disability tax credit. Even if you could claim Canada Pension Plan disability does not mean that you're eligible for the disability tax credit or workers' compensation or indeed other tax credits, because there are lots of other tax credits that the caregivers can claim. And you can claim these tax credits even in situations sometimes where the person with disability is not eligible for the disability tax credit. So I always amazed at how complex something which I think should be relatively simple gets. So that was a disability tax credit. That's how it works basically. And have you got a sense of that? Is there any questions about that? Okay, then I want to talk about another aspect of the disability tax credit, and that the disability tax credit is a gateway to other ways of planning and supporting the person with disability. Well, why is the disability tax credit so important to get in the first instance, besides the fact it's a fair chunk of change? Well, a very, very important aspect of the disability tax credit is it allows a person with disability to qualify for a registered disability savings plan. And that is a tremendous, great deal, which the government itself has recognized that more people could qualify it, but it's complex and it's difficult, and it's an underused tax shelter, tax provision. So we're going to talk about the Registered Disability Savings Plan. And you can get other kinds of credits and health. Child fitness credit is doubled, children's art credit. Something called a disability trust is of profound importance. And that disability trust is a qualified disability trust. We use the word qualified disability trust. It's a special kind of trust which can be essential in planning the estates of parents who have children with disability. I just want to talk for a moment about the advantages of a registered disability savings plans here. What's the advantage? Well, the person with disability or the person with disability's friends or family, whomever, can make contributions during that person's lifetime until age 45 to the Registered Disability Savings Plan. And those contributions, when they earn income, are not taxed. And that's not so great in some sense. It's great over the years, but the contributions to a Registered Disability Savings Plan are not tax deductible like contributions to a registered savings plan. They are more like a tax-free savings plans. Measured is a person with disabilities income. So it's an incredibly useful and fairly rich program to support persons with disabilities. It was brought in by our former Minister of Finance, who was attached to, I think, a family member who was very disabled. It does represent, to some extent, a very middle and upper middle class way of planning for persons with disabilities. And I think in recognition of this, however, what they put in the registered disability savings plan is even if you have no money as a person with disabilities, but if you qualify to claim the disability tax credit, you can set up one of these plans with a bank, and they'll do it free, and you can sit back and do nothing. And for, I forget how many years, but it's quite a substantial sum, you can contribute, you can sit back and the government will contribute $1,500 a year to you, which is really quite nice. And if you can come up with contributions of your own, or your family can make contributions, then they'll match or more than match your contributions up to a maximum of $3,500 a year. So that is tremendously good for a person with disabilities. And as I said, even if you have no money, why, if you claim the disability tax credit, would you not set up a registered disability savings plan to get the free bonds? You don't even have to contribute any money. So the government is very concerned, has been concerned about the low take-up rate of this particular plan. And additional advantages of registered disability savings plans is that when you withdraw the amounts from the registered disability savings plans, you have to at age 59 start withdrawing the amounts. The amounts don't reduce social assistance. And that's really very problematic. Many times when we set up financial plans and trusts for persons with disabilities, the amounts drawing out of these plans will reduce the social assistance, but amounts out of a registered disability savings plans do not. And when the person with disability gets older, these amounts out of a registered disability savings plans don't reduce their old age security, which reasonably they probably wouldn't because the benefit levels are so high, or their guaranteed income supplement. And there's special max benefits for children with disability, that's people under 18.
I'm just reaching back. You said to age 59, but my understanding in the previous slide said you can contribute up to age 49.
That's right, but you have to start drawing out
At 59.
At 59.
Okay.
But you can draw it at age 50.
Oh, you can draw out earlier than that. The problem is when you start drawing out before age 59 is that you may have to end up paying back some of the government grants and bonds. And it's a very complicated mathematical formula.
But if you don't withdraw before age 49,
Then you don't have to pay
then you don't
back
have to
anything.
worry.
No.
10-year offset.
Yeah, that's pretty well, yeah, that's correct. So basically you have to leave the stuff in for 10 years and then you can take it out. But it also depends on some other elements. It's quite a complicated calculation. And I guess the bottom line for us here tonight is it's not something where you put money in, get the government grant, and then just take it immediately out. It doesn't work that way.
It's meant to provide a pension for disabled,
Yeah.
severely disabled people.
I've often criticized that as, for many severe so you have to play along with it.
So you're
And you
saying,
can, yeah.
if you do take it out, then my understanding is no penalty if you took it out after 10 years.
I think that's basically it, but it's not absolutely,
Okay.
but that's generally the rule.
But I mean, you'd be smart to create a pension if your child's been unable to, adult child's been unable to work and has no other means of income, then anything you can do to maximize the pension they're going to get.
Well, once you're 65 or even before, you do get old age security, which is about $5,500 now, and you get the guaranteed income supplement.
But your CPP disability stops.
Yes,
So then
I
you're
suppose.
looking at about $1,000 a month. Can you live on $1,000 a month?
I think it's a little more than $1,000 a month.
But
I
my
think it's like $22,000 for a single person, or is it?
My mother gets
50?
old age security and guaranteed income supplement works out to about $1,200 or $1,300 a month.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think you're right there.
Yeah.
When I think of it. But when you think of it though, how much do people with on social assistance get too? They get even less than that. And that's while they're living now as young people, when they're trying to develop whatever they can of their skills and talents and interests. It always struck me as slightly absurd to say for retirement. I take your point. I think any way we can support persons with disabilities financially, strategically is a good thing. But as I said, I think that sometimes the now here's often.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's why everybody's always interested in how do you get money out, but it's complicated and it's tricky. And so that you can't set them up with that idea. Just to show you how registered disability savings plans work, assume we're in 2014 last year, we started contributing. And there's income limitations on this, as I indicated. If we contributed $1,500 ourselves, the person with disability or the person with disability's family, and we got a more than matching grant from the government of $3,500 in 20 years, we would have $165,000. So that's a very significant lump of money for essentially contributing for 20 years, $15,000, $30,000. So that's how it can be a powerful tool. But the trouble is, it's, as I said, I criticized it because it's for the future, and often we need it now. Okay, I was wondering if there's anyone want to talk any more about the Registered Disability Savings Plan. I haven't time really this time to talk about it in detail, but for those of you who are not familiar with it, you might consider it, and for those who are more familiar at some point, maybe you can talk about the detail of how you get money in and out of it. I now just want to briefly go through some other deductions or credits that may be claimed by the caregivers for the persons with disability. So these are essentially caregivers' tax credits, or not credits that can be claimed by the person with disability. But I think they're important. Important because, one, these credits can be claimed in addition to the disability tax credit. If you claim the disability tax credit, and if you cannot claim the disability tax credit, generally speaking, you still can claim these particular tax credits. And so I give you the worth of them, the equivalent to spouse tax credit. In a lot of these caregivers' tax credits, the operative thing is that you have to live with a person with disabilities. And again, this doesn't necessarily reflect the lived reality of many people, persons with disabilities with fairly severe mental illness. Often these people are loved ones, do not live with us for various reasons. And so in order to get a lot of these caregiver tax credits, they require that the person live in the family home. And often that's not going to happen. It's not realistic. So the equivalent to spouse tax credit has to live with you. And you can't have any spouse living, and you can't be supported or supporting another spouse. If the person is over 18, it must be a person with disability, must be dependent by reason of mental or physical infirmity. And it's income tested, so this spouse tax credit is equivalent to spouse tax credit is eliminated when the person with disability makes about $12,000 of income after the other deductions that person can take. So the problem with the equivalent to spouse tax credit is, one, your other spouse can't be around, and that's not necessarily a good thing, though sometimes I think so. And I should have said that. And it phases out at a very low income level. But it is.
And the truth is, when you have someone with a severe illness, whether it's physical or mental, it puts such stress and strain on a marriage that a lot of times doesn't survive it anyway.
Yeah, I certainly have witnessed the pattern. And so you might be able to claim the equivalent of spouse tax credit. Normally, you can only claim it with respect to child parents, grandparents, and siblings. They must be under 18, but if they're over 18, they have to be physically or mentally dependent, except parents and grandparents, and that's not really relevant to our discussion. The infirm dependent tax credit, it's worth $13.34 on a base amount of $65.89. The thing about the infirm dependent tax credit is that the person with disabilities doesn't have to live with you. And the person has to have a severe and prolonged impairment, usually not working. They must be 18 or over. The problem with the infirm dependent tax credit is it's severely income tested. The person with disabilities starts phasing out when the person with disabilities starts getting over $5,500 of income in the year. So usually I try to imagine the person or the family that would claim the infirm dependent tax credit is often young people who are not working or not on welfare that are still quite ill. You could claim the infirm dependent tax credit, and it's particularly important to people who are really supporting a person in the family, but that person is not living with them, and it's one of the few caregiver tax credits you can claim where the person isn't living with you.
Yeah, if you were in a condo and you're living in a condo, and then you get older and you need to maybe support yourself, and you buy your adult child their own condo, or you own it and let them live in it free, aren't you still providing? Isn't that still considered?
Well, you can provide support even if a person isn't living with you. But it would seem to me that if they're living in a separate dwelling, even a separate condominium.
If they're in the same building.
I don't think,
I mean, the intent of that is, you always have to look at legislation.
Yeah.
What is the intent of that legislation? And the intent of that legislation is that if you are significantly providing for your adult child, that you would get that, right?
I wouldn't say that necessarily. It is because many people won't qualify for, are you talking about the caregivers or are you talking about the infirm dependent? You're talking about the caregivers tax credit. I think it is an amount, frankly, the intent of the legislation was to support people financially. The thinking of the legislatures was a very traditional sick caregiver relationship. Even the government documents show an older person being looked after by children, or about, this woman looking after, traditional, very stereotypical ideas about it. So I think the idea is, a caregiver actually living with a person and providing physical or present caregiving. So I do think that the has to live with you would be fairly strictly interpreted. There's also top-up credit from the federal government worth $314, and it tops up most of these other credits, and it is a family caregiver tax credit. But that's given simply by the federal government and not by the provinces. I want to, before I finish here, because we're moving towards the end of this presentation, just talk a little bit about some other strategies for supporting our loved ones financially who are disabled. And the problem of social assistance and inheritances come up all the time. Because we know that if we leave money to our loved one, we're middle class, we may leave a chunk of money to that loved one, which is going to cause hardship to our other children who may have made a lot of sacrifices during their lifetime in any case. And the result of leaving money to a person on social assistance may simply be to replace for a period of time our money, our hard-earned money, for government money. And once all that government money is spent, then social assistance kicks back. So of course, lawyers and people like me have always been thinking about ways of getting around that difficulty. In some provinces, they have what's called statutory trust. You can set up a trust of a certain amount for a person with disability, and that will not affect their social assistance. That's the case in Ontario, that's the case in BC. It is not, last I checked, and that was only a few weeks ago, not the case in Nova Scotia. There was been much talk about it. Have they, you look surprised.
Well, it's time for me to update my trust, but it says because of recent tax changes, the Henson's Trust
Oh, no.
is now taxed at the highest tax rate.
Yes, it is. I'll have to tell you about that. Okay.
So what do I get instead
Now,
of
just a
that?
minute, I was talking about a statutory trust, which is a trust of the legislation. We don't have one of those in Nova Scotia, is only the point I'm making. I'm not talking about a Henson Trust, because a Henson Trust, which we do have in Nova Scotia, is not a statutory trust. It's a trust set up by private lawyers among people. It's just a series of trusts and contracts. And what we do is we try to get around the problem of social assistance by setting up a trust. And it's what's called a discretionary trust. That is, the trustee of the trust will decide to pay the amount of money in the trust at their discretion. So under trust law, they don't necessarily ever have to spend any money out of the trust on the beneficiary. They may or they may not. It's discretionary. And the reason it's discretionary is it gets around the social assistance rules. Social assistance in Nova Scotia says that you can have a pathetically small $1,000 or $2,000 worth of assets. And after that, you won't get social assistance. So the asset test, when you look at a discretionary right under a trust, that you may get money, but you have no particular right, is worth nothing. So if you're a beneficiary under a discretionary trust, and you have the right maybe to get money, that your asset is worth, how much would you pay for it? Zero. Okay? So you get around the asset test in social assistance. You don't have too many assets to claim social assistance. And the income test you don't get around. If, for example, your Henson Trust pays out money to you, it will reduce your social assistance dollar for dollar. But in Nova Scotia and indeed in other provinces, if that's money's paid for the right thing, right therapies and things that maybe can't be gotten under the public system, they may not require it to reduce your social assistance dollar for dollar. But often it will, and so that means that the trustee of the Henson Trust will pay out amounts under the Henson Trust strategically. And so maybe that month or that period of time, for a period of time, they won't receive social assistance, but depending, there are ways of paying it out which won't affect social assistance so much. Now the problem is the legislation has changed. It just changed a couple months ago. And what the legislation says is it used to be that if you set up something called testamentary trust,
That's it. That's
Yeah.
what I had.
trust you set up under your will at your death, that when they were set up and they were carrying on, and some years they won't be paying amounts to your children, they were taxed at quite low rates. Well, that was considered a loophole, not anything to do with persons with disabilities, but all testamentary trusts, whether for persons with disabilities or anyone else, for my husband, for my kids, or whatever, were taxed at low rates. And the government of Canada saw that as a loophole. And they said, no, we're not going to allow testamentary trusts to be essentially income splitting. So if I die, I have an option. I can bequeath everything to my husband. And then he's got a chunk of money, and when he has to pay essentially tax on it when it makes money. The alternative is I can bequeath property to my husband and set up a series of spousal and testamentary trusts. And the result of that is instead of having one taxpayer, my husband, I essentially, under the old legislation, set up as many taxpayers as I wanted. So you can see the advantage of income splitting. So a colleague in estate practice was telling me that in her practice, they would often set up, people would have 20 testamentary trusts. So this was considered to be a tax loophole, so the government moved to plug it. But the effect on trusts set up for persons with disability is that now the income arising and not paid out in a year to the beneficiary will be taxed at the highest marginal rate in Nova Scotia. So that has changed. However, there's a way around this. Is there anything people would like to ask me about the sort of idea of the Henson Trust as a way of getting around social assistance? Is that reasonably clear? Okay. One way of getting around this problem is the disability trust, or sometimes it's called the qualified disability trust. And I call it a Henson Trust on steroids. And with a disability trust, I think that the most immediately important thing, and it didn't get on the slide, is that the beneficiary of a disability trust is qualified for the disability tax credit. If the beneficiary of a disability trust or previously Henson Trust qualifies for the disability tax credit, then instead of getting those new high rates, it'll be like the old time, and they'll have low rates.
Now, do you have to be a guardian? You used to have to be guardian before.
A
If you were the guardian of the person with the disability, then you got certain tax advantages. You can move your RRSPs to them without tax.
Yes,
You
that's
can
right.
move your RRSPs to your DSP, but only up to the $200,000 max. If you have that, can you move your RRSPs to that?
To a disability trust. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of complicated because when you leave your RRSPs to a child with disabilities, then there are particular tax concessions for that as well. So I guess you could, you could leave it to a disability trust. I guess, okay, there's a couple things you're asking me all at once.
Okay.
And the answer is yes, you can leave your registered savings plans, RRSPs, to your child in the form of a trust. It is a slightly different trust, which is described in the RRSP legislation. And that will give you a tax concession.
I think you have to be guardian.
There's no, I read that legislation quite recently, and I don't think that in order to leave your RRSPs to the child, that you have to be a guardian, because typically when you're leaving your RRSP proceeds, you've died.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's on your death, so you couldn't be a guardian. There has to be a trustee.
Oh, no, I think if you're,
Yeah.
if you're the guardian, then they don't tax your RRSPs on your, they're gonna treat my RRSPs when I die as if I
Sure.
earned all that money in that year.
Exactly.
But if you're a guardian, that's not the case. It
Well-
can move to the disabled adult child.
I
And
think
it
you don't
takes
have to
the
be
baby-
a guardian.
You think you
Maybe
can do
that
it?
in your particular case, it has a guardian. I think you just have to move and be a parent and move your registered retirement savings plan proceeds to a particular child, your child or grandchild, and it has to be moved in a particular kind of trust, which is described in the RRSP legislation. It may be that your lawyer is saying, well, you have to be a guardian in the sense that you are previously a guardian. It's very difficult for me to know
Okay.
what you say, but I don't think that, as I said, you.
Well, I hope that's, yeah, good.
Yeah.
So it's in the RRSP legislation, you're
Yes,
saying?
that's right. So that we now still have the qualified disability trust, and we can continue our Henson trusts as long as the beneficiary isn't qualified for the disability tax credit. The problem was that previously you didn't have to be qualified for the disability tax credit, and you still can have a Henson trust if you're not qualified for the disability tax credit, but it represents more complex and difficult tax problems now. So now getting into this trust world is essentially getting into a world that is dominated by the disability tax credit. Okay, I don't know how long the people online want to stay and whether you want to end this presentation for the people online. I leave it to you. What I intend to do next is just very briefly, for about 5 minutes, we haven't got much time left, to look at the disability tax credit certificate and how we might fill that out and some of the things that it says on it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about process. I don't know if you want this to be the end of the presentation or whether you want to continue with the video.
Well, they don't have the form, so.
They do.
Oh, they do have the form?
If they want to access it, it's available for them.
Oh, well, then we'll just keep going online.
Okay, then it's up to you. If we turn to the disability tax credit, I handed some of them out. Has everybody got? And this is Form T2201. And as I said, sometimes I think people don't apply for the disability tax credit because often in the chaos of dealing and the difficulties of dealing with someone who's ill, we just don't turn our minds to these things. So here you have the disability tax credit, and so it's possible your loved one or your family can qualify, then you have no excuse. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
How much are you, say there is someone that can possibly work part-time or whatever,
Yeah.
how much are they able to earn per year and still be able to qualify for this?
That's an important question you ask. And the thing with the disability tax credit is it's not income tested. You can earn, the person with disabilities can earn theoretically, there's the fellow who did the brilliant science, the theory of everything. Do you remember his name? Yeah, well, he probably has a lot of money, but he could claim in Canada the disability tax credit. Unlike the caregivers credits, which depend on the income of the person with disabilities, the disability tax credit can be claimed by anyone, no matter what their income. Good question. Okay, let's look at this. You would indicate on the first page there that the form is separated into two sections. Do we have a continuation? No. Okay. Then I'll leave it there. If you look at this form, it's two sections. The first part of the form is just basically sort of giving you an idea of what the disability tax credit is all about. And you see on page 3, the self-assessment questionnaire gives you an idea of maybe whether your loved one or yourself can qualify for the disability tax credit. Looking at some of these answers will give you a flavor, a sense of the qualifications, criteria. Then part A of the form is simply the part that the person with disability or the representative has to fill out. And basically there is also provision in the middle of the page there about how you might transfer the disability tax credit. And it does ask the question on question number 2 on page 1. It's number 1 at the bottom. It's very confusing there, but the first couple pages are not numbered, and then we go to the disability tax credit certificate, and that actually is page 1. Does anyone see? You go through a couple pages, and then you come to page 1, and that's actually the start of the disability tax credit certificate. Yeah. And what we do is fill out, among other things, to see whether there can be a transfer is items number 1 and 2 here. Does the person with disability depend on you for regular and consistent support for one or more of the basic necessities of life? So that's really what they seem to be zeroing in here, because in most cases it would be parents and children. Okay, then you see in part B is the part that must be completed by a qualified practitioner. And most of the provisions in this part of the form, page 2 on, are basically provisions dealing with physical disabilities. So we see vision, and we see speaking, hearing, elimination, walking, dressing, feeding. And then we come to page, I think it's 8. Put my glasses on here. 6? 6. Yeah, that's right. We go to page 6, and we see that examples of markedly restricted in the mental functions necessary for everyday life. And you can see above that, they give some of this gobbledygook, but I'm not really, as a lawyer, I don't understand, for example, what adaptive functioning so much, but the examples are useful. And it's related to self-care. So one of our loved ones, particularly when they're going into a bad period, self-care gets not looked after. Health and safety, ability to initiate and respond to social interaction, and common simple transactions. So adaptive functioning, if there's not adaptive functioning, but that's fairly low level of operation for the individual. The one that seems to be more relevant to many, many situations of persons with mental illness is the third criteria, which is problem solving, goal setting, and judgment, taken together. And then it seems to be more familiar and more receptive to persons with mental illness when they talk about the ability to solve problems, set and keep goals, and make appropriate decisions and judgments. Now, and they say a restriction in problem solving, but again, they put that 90% of the time criteria in. But then they give some examples, and the example that may be relevant, and not necessarily to people with psychotic episodes, but for the whole general way we look and we see people progress and regress in mental illness. They give, for example, your patient experiences psychotic episodes several times a year. Given the unpredictability of the psychotic episodes and the other defining symptoms of the impairment, your patient continues to require daily supervision. And there's where I find that we have to kind of wiggle into that suit a bit, where our loved ones may go for periods of being quite well and then have breakdowns. Can we fit within that criteria that's described there on the page? Then on page 7, life-sustaining therapy, not appropriate for what we're concerned about. And on page 8, that's where you have both mental illness and physical illness, which may be the case, but I haven't had time or opportunity to talk about it. So we're just talking about a single ailment, which is mental illness. And then we find that the physician has to certify the effects of the impairment. And I think this is quite a significant, important part of this certificate. And some, not coaching of the doctor. Sometimes I think that if you go in and you have some words or sentences they might adopt, that might be useful to fill out this section. And there's some other questions there. Now, with respect to mental illness, the person who can sign it will be a doctor or a psychologist. And as it was indicated previously by a participant in this meeting, it's not at all unusual for the CRA to come back and ask for further information. There are a number of groups in the city, and they're on Government Canada's website, where they have, they do assist people in filling out these forms, assist them on finding the right words that are necessary for these forms, and you can sort of contact those people and ask for help. The other people that are help online, you'll see lots of companies willing to assist you, but that can be very expensive, and really I don't think it's recommended. If you qualify, if a person qualifies for a disability tax credit, then automatically Revenue Canada will give it for that particular year and the previous 2 years. If the disability has been subsisting for a long period of time, and for whatever reason, nobody has applied for the disability tax credit, they are prepared to go back 10 years and give you the disability for 10 years, which would be a huge amount of money for some people. And that is why it's always important for people to consider whether they might qualify for the disability tax credit. That opens up some opportunities with the Registered Disability Savings Plan, and it makes planning with the use of trust much easier. So I commend the reading of this information to you. Reading about physical disabilities gives you a sense of the approach to mental disabilities, and to keep in mind how important and how central the disability tax credit is in financial planning for persons with disabilities. So if I could have any questions or anything?
Well, only that, like, it's often denied,
It is.
and by wording of the physician or whatever, you can appeal.
Yes.
And I also would urge anyone to appeal it, and even revenue tax agency can be helpful in telling you what's needed for the appeal. And I would urge anybody to go for the appeal and go full force into the appeal, because it may take a while. It took me a year, but we did get it. And it was several phone calls and letters and
Oh, yeah.
paperwork, a massive amount of paperwork being sent to them.
The attitude of the courts has been that, we should take a little interpretation, and where it seems that it should be awarded, where a person's claimed, that they should have the balance of probabilities on their side. And that's the attitude once you got up a little higher.
Yes.
That at the initial stages, you might meet with a lot of resistance. So your tactic of, perseverance is a good tactic, and it might result in success. Yes?
Are the slides going to be so that you can make available to people or not?
Yes, they can have the slides. They're online, if that could be.
Yeah, they can.
Yeah.
They can
Right,
get that to
and
me.
I have them, I've saved them, so if anyone wants them, they can email me and I'll send them. Okay, well, thank you very much, Faye. This was very informative. And
Excellent.
it's answered a lot of questions and very, very helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think you're very good on this.